All right, good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Hope you guys had a good weekend. Just a quick announcement before we get started. Your final assignment. We are rapidly coming to the end of the semester. It's kind of shocking when I look at how few classes we actually have left. I think, what are we, 2 weeks until the end of the semester? Your final assignment is due the 29th of April, so just to have that on your radar, that's up on the BSpace website. I'm also going to be updating the website with all of the other lectures, so you might start thinking about going through the lecture slides if there's anything that's unclear, any questions, now's the time to start taking stock of, what you might want to ask Tony or myself as we ramp up for the final, because there's been a tremendous amount of material, obviously, that we've covered since then. We don't have to talk about the final yet. I mean, we have plenty of time before that gets going, but again, it's not going to be anything that's going to catch you off guard. That said, I am going to hold a review session. It'll be an informal review session for the final, so you guys can come with questions, and I'll give you guys more information about that when we get a little closer to the time at hand. So any questions before we get started today? I got office hours today again too, so feel free to stop by from around 12 to 1. And if not, why don't we pick up where we left off last time? Just trying to kill the lights here. It's a little dark, isn't it? There, let's do that. All right, so last week we were looking at the reign of Shalmaneser III, and we were looking at particularly Shalmaneser's relation to this large kingdom that begins to take hold in Urartu, right, around Lake Van and Lake Urmia. And really it's this weakening that takes place during the reign of Shalmaneser and shortly after the reign of Shalmaneser that allows Urartu to really take advantage of a lack of Assyrian centralization to gain the power and prestige that it does. Really, we were looking at a period of about 60 years following the reign of Shalmaneser III, in which Assyrian might, we saw Shalmaneser, was able to expand the borders of the empire to a limit that had not been seen before. It really starts to shrink a bit shortly after Shalmaneser III, with pressure from empires like Urartu and also disruptions in the far west, also in Babylon too. So for this period of 60 years, we see a series of weak Assyrian kings follow Shalmaneser III. In this early 8th century, we also find that local provincial governors, again, we talked about the system of Assyrian administration with these provincial governors who have to report back to the center, right, at Kalhu, at Nimrud. These provincial governors begin to break away. They begin to usurp Assyrian power and really become small kings again. So Assyria is now in danger of that process that we've seen over and over and over again, right? A large empire that expands beyond its boundaries of sustainability and then, right, starts to fragment, starts to fall apart. Urartu starts getting powerful. And in the far west, at the site of Tilbarsip, we see a local provincial governor by the name of Shemshi-Ilu, who starts to essentially break away. Shemshi-Ilu is what's known as a turtan, or a provincial governor, and his palace is at the site of Tilbarsip. And we'll take a look at Tilbarsip because it's a great example of this interim period of 60 years in which Assyrian power begins to quake a little bit. Tilbarsip, actually, in addition to being an Assyrian capital, it was the capital of the Aramaean kingdom. It was known as Bit Adini at the time. It was actually conquered by Shalmaneser III in 856. And when Shalmaneser took it over, he named it after himself. So this was known as Kar Shalmaneser to the Assyrians themselves. So certainly, an Assyrian site in its truest form, at least taken over by the Assyrians. So Shemshi-Ilu, as a Turtan governor, becomes particularly powerful, and we can see that in the art and the iconography that he adorns his palace with, there's an usurpation of of Assyrian royal iconography and the roles, the traditional roles of the king. For one thing, we know that he starts leading campaigns in his own name. So from records at the palace at Tel Barsab, we see Shemshi-Ilu starting to go on annual campaign in his own name, conquering surrounding territories, not in the name of the Assyrian Empire, but in the name of himself. So this is, of course, tremendously risky behavior. The palace itself, as you can see here at Tel Barsab, bears a very strong resemblance to the Northwest Palace at Nimrud, which in itself, right, draws on all those earlier Neo-Assyrian palaces we've looked at before with the inner and outer courtyards, the adjacent throne room, and of course we see the same thing here. Several interior courtyards surrounded by small storage rooms and residence rooms. The adjacent throne room, right, with a bent axis approach coming in from the central courtyard. So there's the outer courtyard, inner courtyard, actually another one here, and then a long oblong throne room, right? Just like what we saw with the inner and outer courtyards at Nimrud and the central throne room here. Also, there's great evidence of some of the bathrooms. For example, you can see here one of the, actually I'm sorry, this is the gate area. That's totally wrong. I'm sorry, but you actually have drainage, right? Which is going from this major courtyard, which would have been open. You can actually see the drain pipes leading from some of these rooms, which would have been bathrooms, and would have had water and ablutions for cleaning. And they would run all together, right, out the front, out of the gate at Tel Barsab. So, and actually we see this at most gate complexes. Gates are great ways of getting all the water, although there's very little, of course, you know, in this region, all the water that is collecting in courtyards out and keeping it from eroding the foundations of the structure. So anyway, at Tel Barsab, we have this large governor's palace on the Acropolis. And if we look at some of its adornments, we find that, for one thing, it has massive gates that we're talking about in a moment. And these gates are very similar to the ones that we saw at Balawat. They are hinged in the sense that they have two large sockets, right, that come down, and they would have swiveled open and shut, just like the Balawat gates. So very Assyrian in design. And also the courtyards themselves are decorated in a way that becomes quite standard for Assyrian palaces and Assyrian administrative complexes during this period, actually throughout the empire. And that's actually to decorate the courtyards with small pebble mosaics. Not mosaics in the sense of, you know, these elaborate later Greek mosaics that you expect to see pictures and things in, but just rough checker patterns, in this case at Tel Barsab. You can see here the overall effect, right, with these laid out black pebbles and white pebbles. Here's a close-up as they're set in mud brick mortar. So it would have been quite an attractive design, and also actually rather easy to install as opposed to large, you know, massive stone tiling. Whoops. At Tel Barsab, while this palace bears a strong resemblance to the palace, the Northwest Palace at Nimrud, has a striking difference in that it doesn't bear any of the carved orthostats that we've come to expect from Neo-Assyrian palaces. That said, it's decorated in the same style, but instead of carved orthostats, we have evidence of wall painting at Tel Barsab. So a much cheaper and easier way to go than actually having these things carved and then painted, right? Because keep in mind, these orthostats at the Northwest Palace would have been painted, right? And so they would have looked similar. In this case, right, they're painted directly on the wall, almost in a fresco technique against the mud brick superstructure, and it would have been a much cheaper way to go. We do have evidence of this painting, and you can see the palette, the color schemes that are used, and some of the pieces that survive. Typically black, white, reds, blues, perhaps other pigments that don't survive. Green, for example, is a very difficult pigment. It is very common for green to break down. Blues are difficult as well. So some pigments survive better than others. But when we look at the types of compositions, we see again, right, that Shemshi-Ilu is drawing on the Assyrian canon, really reproducing almost exactly the reliefs that we see in the center. And keep in mind, Tel Barsip, right, is way out on the periphery. It's way out here, quite far from the Assyrian heartland. But still we see the same architecture and we see the same iconography. Here are some of the wall paintings from the audience rooms at the governor's palace. And again, this just kind of goes to show that this Assyrian iconography remains consistent across mediums, right? We see it in painting, we see it in carved orthostats, we see it in jewelry, we see it in small usable goods, vessels, and the same is true in these provincial capitals. However, what's interesting is we have some depictions in which, for example, we have this Turtan, probably Shemshi-Ilu, bringing bound prisoners, I'm sorry, down here, bound prisoners before, I'm getting it mixed up, forgive me. One example, right? Clearly we have the Assyrian king, in this case, with Shemshi-Ilu bringing a delegation before him. In another series of paintings, however, we have bound captives being brought before this individual who is actually only wearing a diadem and is not wearing the Assyrian crown. And we have good reason to believe that this is actually Shemshi-Ilu himself, depicting himself in a very similar fashion to the Assyrian king. So this is, again, usurpation in its worst form. Not only are you going on campaign in your own name, but now you're starting to depict yourself almost as an Assyrian king. The difference, again, here being the headgear, right? Because its Assyrian crown is quite different than the diadem being worn by Shemshi-Ilu. And also having prisoners brought forth to you from your own campaigns, a very Assyrian thing to do. So again, we're seeing this clear appropriation of iconography, and it just kind of goes hand in hand, right, with what we have from texts that talk about the weakening of the central authority and the strengthening of these provincial governors as things fall apart. So this goes on for about 60 years until 744 BCE, where we see the rise of an Assyrian king by the name of Tiglath-Pileser III. It's up here, 744 to 727 BCE. He's affectionately known as TP3. So if you read about TP3, or we mentioned TP3, that's what we're talking about, just because it becomes a little arduous to say Tiglath-Pileser III. He's possibly an usurper. We don't really know his lineage. He claims royal lineage. He actually claims to be the son of Adad-Ninari. But Adad-Ninari preceded him by almost 40 years, so it's a little tricky. Perhaps he's a descendant, perhaps he actually takes power. What we do know is that it's under the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III that Assyrian military might is reasserted, and he actually goes to places like Tel Barsip and puts the screws on, really tightens down the ship and brings the empire back under Assyrian control. So thanks to Tiglath-Pileser III, you don't see that process of fragmentation. You don't see the Assyrian Empire fall apart and then new empires like Urartu taking power. In fact, it's one of Tiglath-Pileser's first things to do when he comes into power is to campaign against Urartu. He takes an army to the north. But we talked about how difficult that is, right? When we looked at those Urartian sites, those massive citadels on the hillsides that troops can just fall back into during the wintertime and hold out, he tries to capture these Urartian sites like Tushpa on Lake Van. He is unable to really conquer Urartu, but we have some stelae